Baruch Spinoza's Revolution Against the Patriarchy. Spinoza, well-known Jewish, Dutch watchmaker and philosopher, was a student of Machiavelli, whom he regarded as a wise man, sapiens, as he put it, and acutissimus, meaning that he was extremely acute in understanding the nature of things. Objects to the patriarchy and articulates his objection in books that will serve as foundational for the establishment of the modern world. We cannot understand our current situation without tackling the questions that Spinoza tackled. And we best understand our situation when we study Spinoza, looking for the questions that he is facing, the problems he is facing, and thinking about the way he addresses those problems. Spinoza objects to one cardinal problem: the objection raised by a patriarchy against philosophy in general. What is the problem that Spinoza is facing? Freedom to speak one's mind. Spinoza himself will be condemned by his community, the Jewish community, that will readily recognize him as impious. Spinoza's own model will be not Plato and Aristotle, but Epicurus. So, a philosophical hedonist, somebody who holds that pleasure is good and pain and suffering, that's bad. Well, in general, that sounds appealing. However, not everything that gives us pleasure is good. Not everything that gives us pain is bad. And of course, pleasure does not account for itself. However, Spinoza sees that there is a difficulty here, that there is a difficulty with ancient Epicureans, those who follow the principle of pleasure. Of course, for the philosophical hedonist, pleasure is to be pursued contemplatively, in the respect that there are pleasures that are lower, basest pleasures that are mixed with pain. Those are not good pleasures. We have better pleasures, right, that are purged of pain. And so we go to the highest pleasure, which is that of contemplation. Of what? Of the flux of the universe, change. So we're one with the forces of nature. And there we are absolutely passive, in the respect that we are drawn by the currents of change. And there we find peace. Peace because we are no longer rebelling against fate, against existence. What's wrong with that? That is good. But we see here that a good pleasure is a pleasure that is without pain. So we have a sense in which the good is defined more or less implicitly in a negative way. What is good is something that does not have pain. And then we say, well, that which doesn't have pain, we give it a name. It's pleasure. All right. So much for hedonism, or philosophical hedonism. How does Spinoza defend a life dedicated to philosophical hedonism? He knows that there are objections. Those objections are raised by the whole biblical tradition, most notably by the whole biblical tradition, represented by the fathers. The paradigm for the fathers, the biblical God, the one of the prophets, but already the one of Genesis, of Bereshit, where we see that there is a paternal figure who walks in the garden, who checks after Adam and Eve, human beings. And he says there is wisdom, and that wisdom is tied to divine life. Now, if you try to grasp the fruit of wisdom, sever it from its living spring, its living source, right? Then you will end up dying. What does that mean? You will die. Your life will no longer be eternal. You will fall into the dark. You will have acquired, today we might say, a piece of knowledge that has, well, no value in itself. You will be able to use it as an instrument, as a means to do what? Not to return to God, because you have already cut it off. You're a rebel. You're against God now. And so what are you going to use this knowledge for? For power, to empower yourself, to perhaps in some respect, if only symbolically, replace your father. All right. So there's a whole patriarchal tradition that objects to those who seek knowledge, who seek freedom, aside from, cut off from, paternal authority. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with seeking freedom aside from paternal authority? We know that there are limits to paternal authority. Who doesn't know that? Let us recall parenthetically Sir Philip Sidney's defense of poetry, right, from the 1600s. And Sidney speaks of poetry, he defends the poetic life, as a preface to philosophical knowledge, to divine understanding. In some cases, he says, most notably in the case of Plato, the poet is a philosopher who presents himself in poetic garb. So either philosophy speaks, and then it has to be poetic, or what is the alternative? In Spinoza, we get rid of this. And we no longer have the philosopher in poetic garb. We have a demythologized philosopher who replaces poetry, which was the ancient prerogative of the fathers. That's the way the fathers spoke in poetic terms, whether or not they were philosophers. And their poetry served as preface again to philosophy properly understood. So we get rid of the fathers, the paternal authority, and so of classical poetry, and we replace it with a geometrical language, symbolic terms that provides a guideline, a universal guideline for everyone, for all nations, so that everyone may pursue his pleasure. Now, of course, you'll have a hierarchy of pleasures, but the principle of society will no longer be the poetic discourse of the fathers. It will rather be lust for power, for money that represents power. The foundation of nations will no longer be the ancient one. It will be, well, a Machiavellian or modern one, which is to say that now we will try to reconceive, recontextualize, reestablish, refound nations on this mercantile, some might say also mercenary principle of greed, the pursuit of self-satisfaction, which of course will need a mask, which will need a justification. We can appeal to God, to values, to ideals, to justify our egoism, to make it look good, to sugarcoat it. But essentially, a beastly impulse will be seen as foundational for the establishment and thriving of polities. So now man is a beast in the state of nature, and then he comes out of the state of nature as a result of a whole evolution, which involves mechanisms, right? Existential mechanisms. So today we might speak of biological, chemical, biochemical, right? Neurological, you name it, mechanisms, and then eventually social. Right? In the course of this battle, right, of forces, of struggles, right, in the course of this history of struggles, the human being emerges as distinct from ordinary beasts. He emerges with faculties that enable him to distinguish himself from the beast, to purge himself of the beastly. And this is possible now, not merely in pre-modern terms, where we could say people pretend to be civil, right? Whereas in reality they remain beasts, right? For Spinoza, this is possible, and of course we see this also in Descartes, by following rules, regulations, the rules of thought, says Descartes. If we can have these rules, the scientific method, as it were, for politics, for everyday life, we follow regulations. We no longer need the poetry of the fathers. We just trust the rules and regulations, the manual. All we need is an ideology. We need a technical language that would allow us to establish a society in which everyone can pursue his pleasures. All right. Hopefully that is clear enough. this is where we stand today, right? This is the modern world. But what happens here? What happens is that as we establish this new society of rules and regulations, this society emerges as a mechanism in its own right, an overarching mechanism, great guarantor of our liberty. Everyone can pursue his pleasure, and that's what is seen as freedom. Freedom is the pursuit of pleasure. Of course, for the philosophical hedonist, this means that you have to work towards being one with the universe. And so, this kind of ascent will involve a fusion of freedom and necessity. The necessity of existence will be the essence of freedom. So you're no longer free, really, in an ordinary way. You shed the veneer, you shed this mask of the promises of freedom. Enjoy yourself, do whatever you like. That's just a facade. But slowly you begin to understand that, oh no, well, what freedom really means is to be one with the forces of the universe. And so really it means to shed the freedom. Right? Because these forces of the universe are mindless. There is no father in charge. They're just mechanisms, dynamics. So they're impersonal. So now you're one with the absence of mind. This is an irony, one might say. Reason, that in the modern case is defined as working with rules and regulations. Now, at the pinnacle of its journey, now is a wisdom that sheds all rules and regulations to be one with the unfathomable forces of evolution. This is wisdom. So we need rules and regulations to be free from the authority of the fathers. But this freedom turns out to be, in fact, the end of freedom. One could call this a paradox. But, of course, the Bible and the fathers had long warned against this, and so Spinoza will be shunned as essentially a heretic by his own community. Now, in this society that Spinoza helps establish, the society of rules and regulations that, again, are there to guarantee your right to pursue your pleasures, in this society, what we have is a fundamental alternative to classical society. What we have is the rise of a machine that is supposed to assure us that our pursuit, my pursuit of pleasure, will not impinge upon yours and vice versa. So everyone's autonomous within the machine, within the grid. My pursuit of pleasure, my freedom, stops where yours begins. However, this dream of peace that is guaranteed by the machine, essentially, by a mechanistic society, of rules and regulations cut off from the poetic life of and discourse of the fathers, again. This pleasure, this system, this machine, this peace that the machine is supposed to guarantee, doesn't work well, does it, today? Why not? Well, does Spinoza foresee our own times? That is questionable. However, on a grand scale, there are no reasons to dismiss the possibility that Spinoza foresees the end game. What is that? Well, harmony with the forces of evolution through the shedding of rules and regulations. How does this happen? How could this happen? Well, if rules and regulations are there to guarantee peace, universal peace, internally or privately, people, not being philosophers, they're going to be struggling for base pleasures, pursuit of money to satisfy their immediate desires. Inevitably, they will feel hostility towards others because they will recognize that others are getting what we want for ourselves. So in private, everyone is at war against everyone else, whereas in public, we all have to be at peace. How is this sustainable? Inevitably, there will be conflict between those who have and those who don't have, the haves and have-not. The machine will take over more and more, and in the name of peace, it will rob everyone of pleasures, even the most simple ones, and it will thrust people into a life, or rather survival, of compulsion, where you have to work for the machine, for the rules and regulations, to get less and less pleasure and more pain. Pleasure reduced to vain entertainment, that as a drug we get used to. So we need more and more of it, quicker. And this means that we tend toward a conception of pleasure that is that of a thrill. So our pleasure becomes so barbaric, so brute, that it is indistinguishable from violence. We take pleasure in violence. The thrill, the boom, the big bang or the little bang, this is what gives us pleasure. And so we look at the news and we look at all kinds of violence on the screens. Life becomes superficial, it's empty of meaning, of depth, so it's all about a screen. And on the screen we have violence, bang, bang, shocks, shock effect, shocking news, brutal, destruction. This is what catches people's attention. This is what people lust for. So what we have is a rejection of all kind of silence, of moderation, of peace, in favor of thrill, excitement, bang, violence, war, violence. This is what gives us pleasure. This is what we see pleasure as. Essentially, what we consider pleasure is violence. Violence is pain. So, as we become more brutish as a result of our being stuck in this machine world, machine society, cut off from the natural language and society of the fathers, we don't become philosophers. No society has ever been established on a purely philosophical foundation, or on a poetic foundation. The attempt to establish a society on purely scientific, or technical rather, terms does not lead us to universalizing philosophy, or even Epicureanism. In other words, at the end of the unfolding of the modern project, we don't find a world of philosophical hedonists, but one of brutes for the most part. And the philosophical hedonist, whoever is left, will he be able to say whatever he thinks? No. Because in the midst of brutes, first of all, whatever he says is ineffective, because they don't give a damn. And secondly, they're very suspicious against anything that is not violent, that doesn't feed directly into violence. And the philosophical hedonist doesn't really like violence, although he accepts it on a cosmic scale. But this acceptance involves a kind of pact with the devil in traditional biblical or patriarchal terms. It says, I want peace. I'll accept the flux, the vortex of things, of nature. I'll be one with it. And this way, I won't be threatened by it. Right? I will leap onto the crest of the wave. This way I won't drown. Wherever the wave takes me, if it takes me to establish Auschwitz, so be it. But I won't drown. I'll accept it. Whatever comes, I'll accept, and I won't drown. So I won't be scared. I will be at peace in that acceptance of whatever comes. This is the philosophical hedonist. So, can he go out and tell the brutes, hey, look, you are brutes. You need to elevate yourself to this realm of, well, they say no. No. Nobody has educated them for that. You don't rise to philosophical hedonism on the basis of the pursuit of brutish objectives, pleasure. Spinoza was not raised by brutes. He was raised by the fathers. And all the modern philosophers who will then appeal to the principle of philosophical pleasure are really rebelling against their own upbringing. But this rebellion is indebted to that upbringing. There's a poetic streak to them. Machiavelli, Spinoza, they're poets still. But in a society that is founded on the rules and regulations set out by the rebels, people are not raised poetically. People are not going to become Spinoza and Machiavelli. They will simply remain on the level of brutes, and they will object to Spinoza. They might use some of his words to justify their own vileness, but they will not rise to his level. They will, in fact, deny that there is such a thing as this philosophical liberation from the demands of the moment, the demands for violence, for war. We have to war. We're all, our minds are all enmeshed in strife, this local strife, not the universal. the universal order of things. No, we don't know that. We're stuck in this little corner of the universe, this little spit in the bucket. And we have to follow the current news and cannot see the big picture. That was a dream. So today's intellectuals and all the other people that are flying around them, they reject the universality of Spinoza, although they will accept his rules and regulations as a model for the establishment of this society of ours. So, the result of the Machiavellian and then Spinoza's revolution will be this establishment of the society in which most people will be brutes and will identify peace with, well, for them peace and violence are the same thing, really. So what happens here? The peace, the universal peace that the society of rules and regulations was supposed to guarantee. On top of that, the freedom to philosophize that it was supposed to guarantee. So the fathers are not going to be able to object to you. The fathers are replaced by merchants. These merchants couldn't care less if you're philosophizing. Well, none of this works anymore. What happens is that peace is replaced with war and radical suspicion against philosophy in its original sense. Of course, philosophy is replaced by other things. And the word itself is used to designate all kinds of things that have nothing to do with philosophy. So it could be a perfume, it could be an attitude, it could be a belief, it could be a system of bullshit. Anything but philosophy. Anything but the philosophical life. So, what we have here as a result of Spinoza's revolution is no philosophical freedom and brutality that rises as freedom, as if it were freedom. The meaning of freedom, to be free, is to be a brute, to be violent. And violence breeds more violence. And so ultimately we're all at war against everyone else. And we use the rules and regulations to fight. We use them to kill. We use them against freedom, a real freedom. You say, well, what is real freedom? Well, if you're a brute, you won't accept what real freedom is, which is tied to the natural upbringing of man, the poetic upbringing of man, which is a preface to the philosophical life, which involves not passive acceptance of existence, brutish existence, however it happens, things happen, but assent to a good that is pure, that is undefiled, that transcends all evil. The good that transcends all evil is rejected by Spinoza as soon as he rejects the fathers, the patriarchy. What is patriarchy? Bad. Violence, abuse. It's unnatural. An imposition on my pursuit of pleasure, philosophical pleasure. Okay. So there we have it. That's where we stand today. Is there a way out of a society that essentially is set up as a machine of war, where everybody winds up killing everyone else, as we find in Hamlet, life without poetry? Can we step out of it? Well, the first condition, the paramount condition to step out of it, would be recovery of the poetic, patriarchal life. Reverence for that voice, the voice of poetry, which is the voice of the fathers. Whether or not they're philosophers, that's not the point. That voice serves as a preface to the philosophical life, which again, in its proper sense, is a life devoted to the good itself. So it's a life understood as journey toward the undefiled good. Most of us will not recover that reverence, that piety, that pietas in the Roman sense of the term, reverence for essentially paternal authority. And so the alternative is feeding into the machinery of war, which winds up translating into a collective suicide. Because we're all preparing this machine that will guarantee, foster, drive us all towards collective destruction, right? Where we all kill each other. So it's really a machine that we all give our lives for. We start working for the machines, for the rules and regulations, so that they can guarantee our destruction. We're building a bomb, essentially, in which we can hide and we can all explode together. Moved by compulsion, the principle of compulsion, everything else is a masquerade that poorly veils this drive towards destruction. That is the condition. Spinoza, nowhere to be found today. Or rather, we find him volens nolens, he is there. Willy-nilly, he's there in the rules and regulations that, to be sure, are always shifting. Nevertheless, they're still rules and regulations in their essence. That's what they serve a purpose. This purpose we've seen, and the only way out is one that very few will take. It is not a question of simply saying, well, it's my choice, I choose to do this. Well, as soon as you do that, you say, well, how do you choose to return to a place outside of this cage? Well, I'm just going to have a method. I'm going to get some rules and regulations, and it's no problem. I can figure it out. There's a manual for this, and then I'll do whatever I want. It's my choice, my freedom, my body. It doesn't work that way, because when you take that stance, of course, you're impious in classical terms. You're very unpoetic. So it doesn't work that way. So you have to give up the rules and regulations. But to do that, you need anchorage. You need roots. And if you've already rejected your fathers, then you have no roots. And so there is no trust. No trust, no faith. And so you end up as a slave of the machine. As a slave of the machine, you are a victim of compulsion, and you're doomed to that bellum omnium contra omnes.